All right, so good evening and welcome everyone. We will begin with addressing two questions that we had from the English audience. The first one was a question about the three types of trainings, the trainings of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. So I was asking, could Geshe please explain those? So the thing with that is that the three trainings is a very vast area. Actually, all the practices that exist, all the possible practices that we have, they can all be included, categorized, consolidated under the three higher trainings. So it's a very big area. So first of all, in terms of the training of ethics, the training of ethics can refer to assuming vows, and there are 8 different types of vows of individual liberation, for example, that we can have. And we can have lay vows for one day for male and female. We can have lay vows for the duration of the life for the male and the female. Then we have vows of ordination for the highest level of ordination for monks and nuns, the lower level of ordination for monks and nuns, and also we have the trainee nuns. So altogether, we have these categories, 8 vows of individual liberation. In addition to that, we can talk about bodhisattva vows that come with the 18 root vows and the 46 secondary commitments. In addition to that, we have the tantric vows. And in the tantric vows, we're talking about 14 root vows and 8 secondary or gross infractions. So vows is one area of the training of ethics. However, even if you don't have these types of vows, you can still maintain the morality of abandoning the 10 non-virtuous actions. So as you can see, it's a very broad area. Now, in terms of the training in concentration and the training in wisdom, actually these two trainings are explained later on within the practices of the individual of the great scope, because in there we will go into the presentation of the 6 perfections. And when talking about the 6 perfections, we will talk about concentration and we will talk about wisdom. Again, concentration is a very vast subject. There are many types of concentration. However, just very briefly, concentration is keeping the mind focused on virtue without being distracted and remaining single-pointedly on that virtuous object. All right, it's not necessarily calm abiding or strictly calm abiding, but it is something similar to calm abiding because you want to remain undistracted, single-pointedly focused on that. There are countless types of concentration. Then, very briefly, for the training in wisdom, here we're training about developing realization of emptiness. It refers to special insight. It can be the actual special insight of something that is similar to special insight. So as long as you're performing an analysis from within the state of single-pointed concentration. So you maintain single-pointed concentration and you analyze the actual way that things exist. You analyze the reality of how things exist, then this is classified as wisdom. So as we say, all 3 trainings is a very vast area. Okay, so we continue with the second question. The second question had to do with taking on the suffering, accepting suffering, as we said before. But there is a question here that sometimes the suffering is overwhelming. It is very strong, such as, for example, you might get a very serious illness. And when you're suffering with this very great illness, how are you supposed to even practice? How can you meditate? How can you bring this into the path? Okay, so with regards to that, if we look into Lamrim Chenmo, the great exposition of the stages of the path, when we come into the presentation of the six perfections, when we are discussing the perfection of patience, there is this category there, which is the patience of accepting suffering. And in that is presented under two headings. The first heading is the reason why we must actually accept suffering. And the second is the method of doing that. So for the first one, why? What is the reason? Why should we accept suffering? So if the actual reason is because suffering is always present. Suffering is always there. The amount of happiness that we have is very limited. However, the amount of suffering that we encounter is quite significant, and it is a constant experience. If we look into Bodhisattva's ways of life, Master Shantideva says it is very important that we train our mind to accept suffering, because the alternative to not training the mind to accept the suffering is that you become very irritated, and that is making the situation even worse. And in addition to that, if you do not accept suffering, your mind will become defeated. When the mind becomes defeated, you cannot establish any work, any project, you cannot do anything properly. And therefore, that will become a great obstacle to establishing roots of virtue. So that is the main reason why we must accept suffering. If you don't accept it, you will not be able to establish roots of virtue. And the additional reason that we have to consider is that any type of suffering that we experience, whether it is big suffering or small suffering, whatever the size or the type of suffering, all the suffering that we experience is due to past karma that we have created. And the thing is that if we do not accept the suffering, what we will do is we will create additional mental anxiety and mental worry. And this will only impact on the situation and make it even worse. So if we look at the example of, let's say, you have a physical illness, there is something wrong with your body. So there is no question that there is the physical suffering, and this is something that you have to go through. But if in addition to that, you start allowing your mind to generate all sorts of inappropriate thoughts and worries and anxiety and so forth, what you have is not only the physical suffering, but in addition to that, now you have added mental anxiety. So you have two problems. Before you only had the physical, now you have the physical as well as the mental. Whilst if you accept the suffering, you do not have that additional element, the burden of mental anxiety. You just have to deal with the physical suffering. And that physical suffering, it goes through stages. It might start as a big suffering, but in the case of illness, we can see that there is a reduction of that suffering. So that is an additional reason why we must actually train ourselves to accept the suffering. Okay, so remember that the other day we gave this verse from Bodhisattva's Ways of Life by Master Shantideva, where it says, if you can do something about it, why worry? And if you can do nothing about it, why worry? So if you are faced with a difficulty, an adverse condition, illness, suffering, whatever it is, the first thing that you need to do is to investigate, can I do something to get rid of this problem? And if there are means and methods that you can avoid this, change this difficult situation, then by all means employ this. And, why worry? Why be upset about it? If you investigate and you find there is no way that you can change this situation, again, it says, why worry? Because if you worry, you make the situation worse. So in this way, we establish why it is necessary to take on and accept suffering. So you might say, okay, I have gone through this rationale, I have gone through this reasoning, I understand I have to accept it, but how do I actually accept it? What is the method? Because I find it very difficult to accept it. So again, if we look at the presentation of this material, it says in terms of the method of accepting it, we have two. The first one is stopping having strong aversion to it. And the second one, understanding that it is suitable and appropriate to accept suffering. So for the first one, you have to stop having strong aversion to it, because if you generate that mind that I completely hate this situation, you're only going to make it worse. So stop this aversion that completely rejects it. Okay, now we come to the second outline, that it is suitable to actually accept suffering. So again, this is something that you have to consider. There is a specific way of thinking about it. So you look at suffering and you say, well, wait a minute, it's not 100% bad. Actually, here we're going to identify 5 good qualities that come with suffering. The first good quality is that if you experience suffering, that will generate within you the wish to escape or to avoid suffering. So this is going to urge you to generate the mind that is seeking liberation. So it helps you develop your renunciation. That is number one. The second one is that if you experience no difficulty, no pride, everything goes well in your life, you tend to develop pride and arrogance. But when you experience suffering, suffering has this good quality of reducing and eliminate our pride and our arrogance. The third point is that when you experience strong suffering, you stop and you reflect on the situation and you ask the question, where did this suffering come from? And you realize that the suffering is the result of non-virtue. And when you realize that, you generate this aversion for non-virtue. So you want to remove yourself, avoid non-virtue. Also, that was the third point. The fourth point is when you experience suffering, because it is such an unpleasant experience, you start wishing for its opposite. And you understand that its opposite, that is happiness, also comes from its own causes. And you understand that it is virtue that establishes happiness. So now you develop strong liking for virtue. You are attracted to virtue due to suffering. And finally, the fifth reason is that based on your own experience of suffering, you sympathize much better and you can relate much better to the suffering of others. And you generate the wish, because you know from your own experience how hard it is, you generate the wish that says, may they also be free from suffering. So it helps you develop your compassion. These are the 5 qualities of suffering. And if you think along this way, this will help you develop some acceptance for suffering. Again, it is a type of training. And as with any type of mental training, we have to start with the easy or the small steps, right? So it's not realistic to expect that right from the beginning you'll be able to take on and accept heavy and difficult suffering. So you start training with something which is small, and then gradually as your capacity increases, you can deal with a more serious problem. And then eventually you will be able to deal with, the real illnesses, the real problems, the real suffering that we have in our lives. As it said, there is nothing that does not become easier through familiarity. So training here is the key. So first of all, when you first begin, it's not easy, but it will become easier. And this is a process of training the mind to be able to accept suffering have increased your capacity of accepting suffering. Okay, so the other thing is that if you have not done any training and you're totally unprepared, and then suddenly a big illness or a big catastrophe happens in your life, it is, as we say, it's unrealistic. You won't be able on the spot as you're dealing with the illness to also implement this type of training. So ideally, you start training and you have familiarity with this way of thinking before the big illness happens in your life. And then when the big illness or the big suffering, the big problem occurs in your life, you have this type of training in your arsenal. So when the problem arrives, you have some tools to deal with it. Okay, so now we will start with our new material for the class. Okay, so let's see where we are in terms of our outlines. We are looking at ascertaining the path to liberation. We said that in that we have two. We have thinking about the source, and the source is the things that force you to enter within samsara, and then actually asserting the nature of the path leading to liberation. So for the first one, thinking about the source, that are the causes that make you enter within samsara, we have three outlines. How afflictions are developed. The second one is how karma is accumulated. And the third one is how you live one rebirth and conceived in the one birth, and you take the next rebirth. So for the first one, how afflictions are accumulated, we say there are four outlines. The first one is identifying the affliction. The second one is the stages of their development. The third one is the causes of the afflictions. And the fourth one is the drawbacks of afflictions. We have identified the afflictions, and we have said we have the 6 root afflictions. And from those 6 root afflictions, the sixth one is view, and it can be expanded into 5 views. So at the end, we end up with a list of 10 root afflictions, 5 that are views and 5 that are not views. Then in terms of the stages of their development, we said that grasping at the view of the perishable or ignorance, this is the beginning that gives rise to all afflictions, such as attachment and so forth. So now we come to the causes of those delusions, afflictions. There are 6 causes. The first one is the basis. The second one is the object. The third one is the social context. The fourth one is discussion. The fifth one is familiarity. And the sixth one is unrealistic attention. Okay, so for the first one, the first cause we identify is the basis. So the basis of these afflictions is called the seeds or the imprints of afflictions. For as long as we do not abandon these seeds or imprints of afflictions, as soon as we come in contact with the conditions, the affliction will become manifest. It is similar to the example of having a barley seed, and then that seed meeting with the right conditions, the water, the fertilizer, the right temperature, and so forth, definitely it will sprout. Okay. We come to the second cause of generating afflictions, and this is the focal object. So to give you an example, if we talk about desire, it could be, someone of the opposite sex, male or female, whoever you desire. If we talk about hatred, someone who is your enemy. And the thing is that the closer you are to this focal object, to the object of your attachment, the object of your hatred, and so forth, the easier and the more intense this affliction will be manifested. And therefore, it is advised, certainly for beginners, that we try to stay away from these objects that trigger these afflictions, that generate these afflictions. The Kadamba Geshes used to say that you apply the antidote, but at the same time, you keep your distance from that object of affliction. As long as you remain close to that object, you will find it very difficult to avoid the affliction. If you keep your distance, you will find that afflictions are reduced. Okay, the third cause that we give is society or social context, and that refers to being influenced by bad companions, bad friends, right? So if you associate yourself with bad companions, then your faults and your afflictions will increase. We have many stories of that. So anyway, there is one story from two brothers from the area of Pembo in Tibet. So one of them was drinking, the other one was not drinking alcohol. And they went different ways. The one who used to drink, he went to Reting Monastery. And he stayed there for a while. And by the time he left the monastery, he had given up drinking. So he wasn't drinking anymore. The other brother, who would never used to touch alcohol, he traveled to Lhasa. And there he met with company that was going all the time drinking. So he ended up, taking up drinking alcohol. So when he came back home, he was the one drinking now. So it's very important for us as beginners, until we have stabilized our mind and we have stability of the mind, that we do not associate ourselves with bad people, because their influence is very bad for us. And it is very important for beginners to seek the company of wholesome friends, because that strengthens, that supports the beginner. Okay, the fourth one is discussions or presentations. Okay, so here it refers to, for example, reading text that present wrong views. If you read text and publications that present wrong views, immoral practices, things like this, you will be influenced. And similarly, if you go and follow the teachings of a wrong teacher, those wrong teachings will influence you. The next one is familiarity. And you have to understand that the bigger familiarity you have with afflictions, the easier it is to generate it. And since beginningless time in samsara, we have unfortunately created great familiarity for afflictions. And we can see how quickly, immediately, they are generated in our mind. The sixth cause for generating afflictions is inappropriate attention or unrealistic attention, right? So, for example, here, if you have an object of attachment, what you do is you're paying attention to that object and you start attributing qualities, exaggerating the qualities. It has this good quality and that good quality, and it's very beautiful and it's very attractive. So, you're paying attention in the wrong way to that object. If you're dealing with an enemy who is the object of your hatred, you paying attention, and this time you exaggerate the unpleasantness. It is ugly, this person is ugly, behaves inappropriately, does this wrong, does that wrong. So you exaggerate the ugly side. For example, you can pay attention to wrong texts, as we say, that have wrong presentations, and consider them to be, really great expositions, great presentations. And in this way, what you do is you increase your confusion. So inappropriate attention becomes the sixth cause. So we have given 6 causes for generating affliction. In Abhidharma, they mention 3 causes. They say it is due to the reason of not having abandoned that which is subtle and extensive, being in close proximity with the object, and due to inappropriate attention. So for the first one, we understand that afflictions are generated because we have not abandoned that which is very subtle and very pervasive. It's referring here to the seeds and the imprints and so forth. For us beginners, this is something which is quite difficult to do, to deal with straight away. However, if we look at the second cause, which is proximity with the object is something we can do, right? Because we have said you can keep your distance from the object, you can take make sure that you have the right social context and you don't associate with people who have a bad influence on you, and you can read the right types of texts or go and attend correct teachings and so forth. So this falls under the category of being in the proximity of the wrong object or the right object. The third one, inappropriate attention, it refers to this tendency of exaggerating, as we say. So here we need to keep examining our mind. And as soon as we recognize that, okay, now I'm starting exaggerating about the qualities of this object, we should put an end to it and always be aware of the antidotes and try to apply the antidotes. That's the way to deal with it. Okay, so we've talked about the causes of afflictions, and now we look at the fourth one, which is the drawbacks or the disadvantages of afflictions. We can look at the ornament of sutras. It says, afflictions harm me and others. They create much suffering in this life and in future lives. So we have a lot of texts that talk actually about the faults of afflictions. So the other text we can look for in order to identify the drawbacks of afflictions is Bodhisattva's ways of life, various quotations there. So there is one verse that says, even if all beings that in the world were to rise as your enemy, they could not send you into the hells of Avicii. However, afflictions can cause you very easily to take rebirth in that deepest of the hells. Right? So imagine if all sentient beings were to harm you and so forth, they could not push you into taking a rebirth like this. However, afflictions can cause you this type of rebirth. The second one is like this enemy of afflictions has been harming us since beginningless time until now, continuously, uninterruptedly, whilst other ordinary enemies only harms us occasionally. So you can see that the harm that we get from afflictions is much more serious. And finally, it says when you're dealing with worldly enemies, if you treat them nicely, they might even turn around and benefit you at some time in the future. However, with afflictions, if you treat them nicely, they will never benefit you. What they will do is they will create more suffering for you. So you can see the big difference. It says it's not like an ordinary enemy. Affliction is a different type of enemy. So we'll continue with another quotation from Bodhisattva's Ways of Life, where it says, if an ordinary enemy were to come near you, you would be afraid. So the ordinary enemy here refers to, an ordinary person, a mundane enemy that you have, a real person who's enemy. If that person were to come near you, you will feel very threatened. You would feel very uncomfortable. However, it says the enemy that has harmed you for a very long time is right next to you. And for some reason, you're not afraid of this enemy. Is this appropriate or not? So the real enemy, which is the enemy of affliction, is right there next to you all the time, next to you. However, for some reason, you do not see it suitable to be afraid of affliction and negativity. Now, we have another quotation that says that all the negativity and all the problems that will come from afflictions, and all the obstacles we have to the higher states, to liberation and to omniscience come from afflictions. So, the higher states here are the rebirths for humans or gods. So all the obstacles to all the good things we want to obtain and all the problems that we have come from these afflictions. So the lamas of the past used to present this in the following way. By knowing the causes of afflictions, so tonight we have mentioned 6 causes of afflictions. So by knowing the causes of afflictions, avoid the ones that you can according to your present capacity. By knowing the nature and the classification of afflictions, be ready to immediately identify them as soon as they occur. By knowing the faults, the drawbacks of afflictions, be able to recognize them as the enemy. And by knowing the antidotes of those afflictions, you will be able to uproot them, to eliminate them. So they say this is the way that you should practice. So you must have heard this Geshe Ben Gungyal. There are a lot of stories about him. So he was always very vigilant in terms of recognizing afflictions and dealing with afflictions. So when a bad thought arose in his mind, or, when he had a non-virtuous thought, with his right hand, he would slap his left hand. Is like, punish him, punish him. He would punish himself. It's like, what are you doing? What are you thinking? What was this all about? So like a physical reminder of having a negative thought. If he had a positive thought, right, a virtuous thought, the right hand would kind of like stroke in a gentle way the left hand, like, well done, you've done well today. So just to recap where we're looking at the source of suffering, the stages that throw you or make you enter within samsara. In that we have 3 main outlines. The first one is how afflictions are developed. The second one is how karma is accumulated. And the third one is how you die from this life and how you migrate into the next life. So for the first one, how afflictions are developed. We examine this under 4 outlines. First of all, identifying the afflictions. The second one is the stages of their development. The third one is the causes of the afflictions. And the fourth one is the drawbacks of the afflictions. So as we say, the first thing that we have to do is to identify those 10 root afflictions and then understand how gradually, if you have the first one, how you develop the rest, and so forth. Once you understand all this about how afflictions are developed, the next thing that you come to understand is how karma is accumulated due to these afflictions. Okay, so remember that we are in this section where we're talking about how to develop the attitude that is seeking liberation. And in order to do that, we did a contemplation on the general aspects of suffering and then the specific aspects of suffering. So that presentation is actually in accord with the Buddha's 4 Noble Truths. And in particular, it begins by introducing the first truth, which is the truth of suffering. The Buddha said, no suffering. No suffering means you must recognize suffering as suffering. You must come to recognize it. And this is why we're going through this detailed and general explanation of different types of suffering, to recognize suffering. Once you recognize suffering, you will generate that wish that says, I want to be free from that suffering. And if you have this wish to be free from that suffering, you would look at the cause, at the root of that suffering, and you will understand that I will have to put an end to the cause of that suffering. So in terms of the cause of that suffering, we identify the cause or the origin as being karma and afflictions, isn't it? And the Buddha taught the second truth by saying, abandon the origin. Okay, so from this, the origin, the karma and afflictions, we have already talked about the afflictions. So now we will see how we accumulate karma due to these afflictions. Keep in mind that both karma and afflictions are considered to be the origin. the origin of suffering. If you take a rebirth in samsara due to the power of karma and afflictions, that rebirth will be a rebirth that is an experience of suffering. So the whole reason why all this is presented in this way is so that we can generate aversion for suffering. It means renunciation. It means seeking to develop liberation. Yes. All right, so having said that, we are looking at the origin, which is karma and afflictions. We say that we are motivated by afflictions, and due to those afflictions, we create karma. So now we want to see how we accumulate karma. In that, we have two major outlines. The first one is that we identify the karma that we accumulate, and the second one is how do we actually accumulate it. So the first one, in terms to identify what karma is, when we talk about karma, we say we accumulate karma, right? This refers to the mental factor of intention. So the karma that we accumulate is intention, is a mental factor. So this is the general presentation. Now, according to the various Buddhist schools, there are some variations. So, for example, the first school, the Vaibhashika school, the Great Exposition school, actually posits that you can have karma that is form. So they talk about physical and verbal actions and say this is karma that is form. And also the Middle Way Consequence School has similar presentation with the Great Exposition School. All the other schools and the general presentation is that karma is the mental factor of intention. Okay, so to give you an example, right, about karma that we say is the intention, you know, when you have magnet, right, a strong magnet has the power to move, physically move, attract or turn this way or the other, a piece of iron or a little needle, okay? Although the magnet itself does not have a mind, does not have a motivation and so forth, however, it has the power to physically move a needle. Okay, and now they say, look at this mental factor of intention. The mental factor of intention actually has the power to stir you, right? It will stir you to either a positive direction or a negative direction. It will make you act in this way or another. So it's the main motivator, the instigator, the motivator. To give you an example, you can be motivated by non-attachment, non-hatred, non-confusion, and motivated in this way, engage in a positive action. So that is described as accumulating virtuous karma. On the other hand, you could be motivated by strong attachment, strong hatred, strong confusion, and engage in negative action. So in this case, we say that you accumulate non-virtuous karma. Okay, so we mentioned before that there are variations according to the different schools. So for the first school, the Vaibhashika, the Great Exposition School, they say that their karma is a form. So for example, as you're carrying out the activity of killing, they posit that you create revealing and non-revealing form, and that is the karma. And this is something that applies to physical actions and verbal actions. The other schools, such as, for example, the Sutra school, the Mind-Only school, the Middle Way Autonomy school, they say that karma is only awareness. So they say as you carry out the activity of killing an animal, for example, you have that intention to kill as you're carrying out the activity of killing, and that intention, which is awareness, is what karma is. So it is different from the presentation of the Great Exposition School that posit karma as something physical. They do not, the other schools do not posit it as physical. Okay, so if we look at the different types of karma, we have two types. One is karma that is intention, and the other one is karma that is intended. So for the first one, karma that is intention, they refer to the initial motivation at the time of the cause. So when initially you conceive that idea and you say, I want to kill that animal, I must kill that animal. So that initial idea, that initial intention is karma that is intention. And then we have the motivation at the time of actually carrying the activity. So at the time that you apply yourself to the act of killing, what happens there? You have what is called the intended karma. So this is how the Sutra school, the mind-only school, and the Middle Way autonomy school talk about karma. Okay, so now we say that motivated by a particular intention, we accumulate karma. So that karma that we accumulate is karma that has the power to project us or to throw us into another rebirth within cyclic existence. So we want to look at the classifications of this projecting karma that has been accumulated. In general, there are many, many ways you can classify karma, and there are many different types of karma. But here we're looking at the basic classification of karma into non-virtuous, virtuous, and invariable. Okay, so the non-virtuous karma, it is karma that is non-meritorious. So it is karma that is non-virtuous actions that you create or you engage based on the view of the perishable. So all these non-virtuous actions that you do is non-meritorious karma. Then meritorious karma is virtuous karma that will project you to a rebirth as in the higher states as a god in the desire realm. And then we have the invariable or the unchanging karma that is virtuous karma that will project you into a birth into the form and formless realms. Okay, so we have identified the three main categories of karma. So let's see now how this karma is accumulated. As we say, everything begins with this view of the perishable, grasping at I and mine, and considering that to be very important. We become greatly attached to this idea of I and mine. And we develop this idea that we want to have happiness and we want to avoid suffering. So now we start pursuing different types of happiness. So if we start pursuing the happiness of this life, and in the course of chasing that, we engage in non-virtuous actions, what we create is non-meritorious karma. There are others who give up on the happiness of this life and instead are interested in the happiness and the pleasures of next life. They create meritorious karma to be reborn as gods of the desire realm. Again, there are others who turn their minds away from the happiness and the pleasure of the desire realm, and instead they are seeking the pleasure or the happiness that comes with concentration. They create immovable karma that will result in rebirth in the first three levels of concentration, of absorption, the first, second, and third absorption. And finally, there are those who turn the mind away from the bliss of concentration, and instead they are looking for the feeling of equanimity, and this becomes the immovable karma for establishing rebirth in the fourth absorption. So as you can see, everything starts with grasping at the view of the perishable. You become attached to yourself. You start seeking pleasure or happiness, and there are different levels of this. The first level is happiness for this life. It will make you create non-meritorious karma. The next one is seeking the happiness of the next life. It will make you create meritorious karma to be reborn as a desire realm god. The next one is not being interested in the desire realm, but looking at the yearning for the pleasure of concentration. You will create immovable karma for the first three absorptions. And the last one is not even looking at the pleasure of concentration. You want to have the feeling of equanimity and create immovable karma for the fourth absorption, the peak of existence. Okay, so as you can see in this process, what we do is we turn away for the attraction that we have for the pleasure of the lower or the earlier state, and we develop interest for the pleasure of a higher state. And then once we get into that state, again, we start aspiring for something else. And every time we let go attraction for the previous state. So the initial attraction that we have is attraction for the pleasures of this life. And then we reverse attraction for this life and we start looking for the pleasure of the future lives. And this is how we accumulate. We aim for that. Right? We aim for that and we accumulate virtuous karma. It becomes meritorious karma that will become the cause that will project us into a good rebirth in the desire realm as a god, for example. Then finally, we reverse the attraction that we have for the desire realm. So now we start aspiring for something in the form or the formless realm. So what we want to have is concentration. Right? So we reverse the attraction that we have for the desire realm and we're looking for something higher. And in this way, we establish virtue, we accumulate virtue. It becomes immovable karma that becomes the cause to be reborn in those higher realms from the first to the third. And then again, we reverse our attraction for that state that previously we considered to be so valuable. And now we are aspiring for, something further than that. And by let going of the previous one and accumulating merit for the next one, we create the causes for the immovable karma that will lead into a rebirth at the peak of existence. So we see that there is this progression of let going attraction for different states of cyclic existence. And eventually there comes a point where we completely reverse any interest, any attraction for all types of luxuries and amazing things in cyclic existence. That means we develop the mind of renunciation. With that mind of renunciation, any virtue that we establish, such as, for example, practicing generosity and so forth, becomes the cause for us to exit, to be liberated from samsara and to obtain the state of liberation. So it becomes a cause that brings us closer to liberation. Now, when we talk about renunciation, we can talk about genuine renunciation, or we can talk about renunciation that is induced. Even if we have that induced renunciation that is not genuine yet, this is something that can help us create imprints even in our sleeps. But the thing is that without renunciation, any virtue that we do does not become the cause to abandon samsara. To do that, we must have genuine, uncontrived renunciation. So we can say that we have created karma in our previous life, and that karma has projected or established the rebirth that we have in our current life. In this current life, and until we move into the next, every day, every minute, we keep creating and accumulating new karma. So we keep depositing karmic potencies within our awareness. Eventually, this life will come into an end. And when we die, we will go through this process of the bardo and transferring in our next life projected through some karma that we have created in this life. So, as we say, the major outlines is to identify how afflictions are developed. The second one is how karma is accumulated. And the third one is how you leave one rebirth, a death, and then you are conceived in the next life. So here with that third outline, we want to look at three things. First of all, how death occurs. The second thing is how do we establish the bardo? And then the third one, from the bardo, how are we conceived in the next life? Okay, so let's look here at the process of death. When we talk about death, we have two types of death. The first one is timely death, and the second one is untimely death. When we talk about a timely death, it means that all the karma that you had established in your previous life that projected or established this current life, all of this karma, all this lifespan has been exhausted, right? So when you die in this way, it is a timely death. The untimely death is when your life that you, like the lifespan that you had established from that projecting karma is not actually exhausted naturally, but you might come into an unfortunate situation, an accident, bad condition, bad situation like this. And although you still have life left in you, actually you meet with your death. Okay, so what happens at the time of death? At the time of death, there will be some karma, the power of some karma that will become activated, and that karma comes into maturation at the time of death. This will be the karma that will establish the type of physical basis that we will have in our next rebirth. Now, we arrive at the time of death with a lot of positive and negative types of karma. So the one that will come into maturation usually is the one that is strongest. The strongest karma will be activated through craving and grasping. And this is the one that will set in motion the process of establishing the next body. All right, so as we say, when we come at the time of death, karma that is the strongest is the one that will be activated and therefore will bring about the result first. If projecting different types of projecting karma are equal in terms of their strength or heaviness, then the one with which we have the most familiarity is the one that will be activated and will establish our next rebirth. And again, if different projecting karmas are equal in terms of strength and in terms of familiarity, the one that will be activated is the one that was established earlier. So the one that was done earlier is the one that will be the first to come into maturation. So now we see that when we come to the time of death, we want to look at the mind of the time of death. These can be three types of minds. It will actually either be a virtuous mind or a non-virtuous mind or a neutral mind. So in the case of dying with a virtuous mind, either your own self, or you will be able to remember, or you might be assisted by those who are near you, and they might remind you your faith towards the guru and the three jewels, and you will make the prayer or the aspiration so that in your next life you will have a type of body that will be suitable for the practice of Dharma, and you pray like this. So if if you die with thoughts like this, then the potency of virtuous karma is activated, and in your next life you will come to obtain a good rebirth, like a higher type of rebirth. Now, in terms of the appearance and the experience that you have as the dying person, it is an appearance of moving from darkness into light. And almost like in a dream, you will have visions of beautiful forms. And also in terms of the suffering that occurs at the time of death, there will not be much suffering. So this is how you die with a virtuous mind. If you die with a non-virtuous mind, so for example, you generate strong attachment for your possessions and your wealth at the time of death, or if you remember your enemy and you generate very strong anger and hatred towards the enemy, then these types of thoughts, this type of non-virtuous mind activates negative karma. And as a result of activating negative karma at the time of death, you will establish a rebirth in the lower migrations. In terms of your experiences and visions, appearances, you will have this appearance of moving from light into darkness. And also you will perceive a lot of ugly and frightening forms, unpleasant forms, almost as if in a dream. And as you go through the process of death, there will be a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. So this is how death with a non-virtuous mind occurs. Okay, so for example, we can have a person that has accumulated great negativity, and that person comes at the time of death. So let's say we're dealing with someone who has killed many living beings. So that people like this, when they arrive at the time of death, they have these visions, these hallucinations. Usually they have visions of all those that they have harmed, but also they have visions of other people or other sentient beings try to persecute them or kill them or hit them and so forth. And they will experience intense sense of fright and fear. They will be very scared, and also we will see that these people suffer with agony and a lot of pain, so the death is like a real struggle. Now, sometimes we find that, as we say, we can support those who are going through the process of death, even if they have negativity. So you might have a person who is sick, and you will have to judge if it is appropriate or not. And sometimes you see that they are receptive, so you can help them to make prayers to the three jewels. You can recite the names of the Buddhas. You can recite some mantras, and that can have some beneficial effect upon them, some calming, some pacifying effect, but only if they are open to this, because there might be resistance for that. Okay, so this is how we can come into the time of death, either with a virtuous or non-virtuous mind. There is also the possibility that we come to death with a neutral mind, and that is without having any specific virtuous or non-virtuous thought. Okay, so we talked here about the mind at the time of death, and we say can be virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral. However, this threefold classification is only applicable up to the point where gross discrimination exists, because when we move into the last phase of death, this gross awareness stops, and the only thing that remains is very fine discrimination, the very subtle mind of death. When we come to the very subtle mind of death, it is all neutral. So there is no classification into positive, negative, neutral. This threefold classification only applies to the earlier stage of death, where we have gross awareness. And that stage stops when the manifest breathing stops. Okay, so what happens is that as we approach this time of death, the person who is dying has the thought that says, I will die, I will become non-existent. And they generate strong attachment for their body. So strong attachment for their body is activated through the 9th of the 12 links, which is taking, and that taking or that grasping establishes the body of the bardo. Okay, so there is another thing that we need to consider. So let's say you have an individual who has practiced a lot of virtue consistently in this life, and they arrive at the time of death, and the circumstances are such that as they enter them, as they generate the mind of death, they remember an enemy, and by remembering the enemy, they generate a lot of anger. By generating that anger, what they do is they actually activate negative karma. And if that negative karma is activated at the end, at the time of death, then it is for sure that they are heading to a rebirth in the hells. So that should be a great warning to all of us, because it says that even though you might have spent your entire life establishing virtue, there is no guarantee that at the time of your death, you will activate virtuous karma. It is very possible that we can activate negative karma. The reason for that is because in our previous lives, we have accumulated countless amounts of positive karma as well as negative karma. Obviously, some of the positive karma has come into maturation because in this life, we have taken a rebirth, which is a higher rebirth as a human. And also we practice a lot of virtue. We had the opportunity to practice virtue in this life and so forth. However, don't forget that we still have remaining negative karma that has not yet come into maturation. So if due to unfortunate conditions, we activate negative karma at the time of death, it can become the predominant and it can lead to rebirth in hells. Also, the opposite is possible. So you can have someone who is engaging in negativity their entire life, and obviously they have accumulated a lot of negative karma in this life. However, there is no guarantee that this person will definitely end up with a lower migration, because at the time of death, they might activate some virtues projecting karma that they have created in the past. So if they generate a virtuous mind at the time of death, that will definitely activate whatever remaining virtuous karma they have created. And if that virtuous karma has greater strength, then it means that they will establish a fortunate rebirth. So as you can see, a lot actually hinges on the type of mind that we have at the time of death. It is entirely possible that we spend this life establishing a lot of virtue, but if we arrive at the time of death with a negative thought, that can activate previously established negative projecting karma, and this will lead us into a bad rebirth. Even if we have spent the entire life engaging in negativity, if we arrive at the time of death with virtuous karma, it can activate virtuous thought, this can activate previously established virtuous karma, and we can end up with a good rebirth. So all of this is possible. Yes. Okay, so then what happens is that the heat dissipates from the extremities of the body and gathers at the heart. And when consciousness arrives there at the heart, exits the body. And this is the final stage of death, because from that point onwards, you will establish the bardo. So in this section of how we die, we still have to see how we establish the bardo after death, and then how we establish the new life by being conceived in that new life. So this will be the subject that we will discuss next week. So as you can see, what we have covered so far is identifying the afflictions, understanding how afflictions are generated. Then we examine how karma is accumulated due to those afflictions. And then finally, how do we pass away from this life and we transfer into the next life? In examining how we pass away from this life, we examine the process of death, the causes of death, the mind at the time of death, and how the heat comes at the heart and consciousness leaves the body at the time of death. And then we remain to see the next phases, which is how to establish the bardo, and then how to establish the next rebirth with conception after the state of bardo. So we will stop here for tonight, and we will continue next week.